Good afternoon. DGOF and Chairman Ordnance Factory Board, Shri Chandrasekhar Vishkarma ji. Member MNC, Shri MR Sablok. Vice President AIOF WWA, Srimati Neha Sablok. Our distinguished former chairman and members, and a particular salute to Shri P.K. Mishra sitting in the front row, sir. Ladies, senior DDGs, friends, brother officers, ladies and gentlemen, and I do see some children, which is a very welcome sight, particularly as I'm going to talk about the history of ordnance factories. The question that is often asked these days is why talk about history at all? Well, I was reading and I just came across that patients of dementia and people with impaired memory function cannot visualize the future. And in these uncertain times, when we have to not only visualize and to fashion and to refashion our future, it is the vividity of memories and the strength of our memory that will enable us to build a befitting future. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I crave your indulgence. I would like to trace the early history of the ordnance factories, which is seldom forgotten in when we tend to glorify more recent exploits. Trotsky said, war is the locomotive of history. And the growth of the ordnance factories helped, or basically came up to aid the expansion of the European powers, particularly the East India Company in India. We might like to deny certain inconvenient and uncomfortable facts of our history, but we cannot delete them. And it is always best to use our history as a basis for change and a source of learning. However, coming back to the conditions that prevailed at that time, the East India Company required arms and ammunition to expand its empire. So the first instance of a multinational company becoming a ruler of a country or of a land, of an empire. So the ordnance factories during that time tended to develop across 6 areas. Cannons had to be mounted on carriages, so we had gun carriages. Ammunition had to be fired from cannon, so ammunition factories came up. Leather manufacture, you had cavalry, you had a lot of leather going into armies, so leather manufacture. Armies had to be dressed, they had to be given uniforms, so you had clothing. And small arms. As small arms evolved from flintlock muskets to rifles to machine guns, you had a small arms manufacture. So briefly, I would like to trace the development of these areas, which is not a linear development, as history often works in fits and starts, by accidents, by unforeseen circumstances. The evolution of the ordnance factories began to take shape into what is now one of the largest conglomerates of defense production in the world, with the widest range of products. So let us start with cannon. In 1769, a temporary cannon factory was set up by Captain L. Douglas in Patna. And with the next year shifted to Fort William. Fort William already had an arsenal, then a foundry was set up to cast cannon, and then a gun carriage agency was also supposed to come up because cannon had to be mounted on carriage. So it was decided to set up a gun carriage agency at Kausipur in 1801 by purchasing 20 bighas from Mr. Thornhill. What is today the gun and shell factory came up. In another interesting anecdote this time, which also harks back to when we talk about quality. In 1811, the board of directors wanted to close down cannon manufacture in India as they thought this was inferior to what was made in England. This was opposed by the military board in India. And finally, under Lord Hastings in 1818, some cannon made in India was sent to Woolwich in England. It was examined by British officers and it was declared to be equal, if not superior, to the produce in England. So there is a history of quality running in the Indian arms production in our country. Gun carriage agencies had to be founded in other places. There was a gun carriage agency that came up in Seringapatam in 1802, which utilized the artisans that became unemployed after the Mysore Wars. In 1810, another gun carriage agency came up in Bombay. And in 1816, the gun carriage agency in Kausipur was shifted to Fatehgarh, because they found that when the wooden wheels of the gun carriages moved to the drier climates of North India, they tended to contract. So it was thought that it would be better if it is built there. Now all these gun carriages have a very interesting history. I mean, this Seringapatam lasted till the 20th century, almost a century. Before that it was closed, when the technological developments had reached their limit as far as Seringapatam was concerned. Bombay moved from the fort area to Colaba, which was then known as the Old Woman's Island, and later became unviable because a railway terminal was supposed to be made there and a railway line was built right across the agency, which caused a lot of convenience. Part of it was shifted then to Pune, and then finally it got merged with the gun carriage agency that was coming up in Jabalpur, the gun carriage factory as we know today. Fatehgarh was even more interesting. It grew and it was overrun during the mutiny of 1857. It was taken over by the rebels. All the European population perished out there. And the rebels started running an ammunition factory and a shell factory inside it. It was finally retaken by the British and closed down because the wisdom of maintaining a garrison at Fatehgarh was no longer deemed to be very sound, and ultimately it all merged with the gun carriage factory. So that is how we have the history of carriage. Another interesting area at that time was gunpowder. Gunpowder mills were set up in all the presidencies, in Bombay, in Madras, and in the Bengal presidency. In Bombay, it replaced an old Portuguese mill. It was expanded, again moved to Colaba. Finally, it was moved to Pune and then to Arvankadu. So there is a direct link of about 200 years between the gunpowder mills of the East India Company in Bombay and the cordite factory Arvankadu, which came up. And there's another interesting piece of history surrounding Arvankadu, that the first hydroelectric power plant in the Nilgiris was built to supply electric power to the cordite factory Arvankadu, which grew and which also developed the new processes for the manufacture of nitric acid and other things, and it got established as a premier ordnance factory. On the other hand, ammunition was, because given the endemic warfare that was conducted, ammunition was always in requirement. The first Afghan war, which was basically lost due to the paucity of ammunition, and in this very city in Dum Dum we have the Afghan Minar built as a memorial to those people who perished in the Afghan war. And it is befitting that the first manufacture of ammunition as a factory came up in Dum Dum. Before that, in every presidency had laboratories and arsenals which used to make ammunition. But gradually, as Dum Dum cantonment was vacated by the Bengal artillery, the laboratory from Fort William moved to Dum Dum, and gradually the manufacture of small arms ammunition started in Dum Dum. Ammunition manufacture continued to grow, and in 1868 a decision was taken for new mills, for a new factory at Dum Dum and another one at Khadki, in which work was commenced at Khadki in 1869 and finished off by 1872. And the two factories, by the end of the First World War, was making about 120 million rounds of small arms ammunition. With another very interesting area was leather manufacture. Right from the 1790s, the Home Government and the East India Company had concentrated on indigenous sources of supply for leather. You had a tannery coming up in Madras, in Seringapatam, in Madras, which later on also started producing boots. You had a tannery in Kidapur run by, in Calcutta, run by two Europeans. The 14th Dragoon Guards Regiment at Pune started a tannery. And there was a tannery in Bombay run by Mr. Bates. The role of the private sector in supply of leather manufacture started shaping up from that time, and there was a comparison, so to say, that was held between the hides produced at Bombay and by the Dragoon Regiment at Pune. And after that, the role of the private sector picked up. However, there were deficiencies of leather were endemic, and in 1854, Lieutenant Colonel Aberthwaite proposed the setting up of a leather manufacturing unit at Kanpur, which is Kanpur as it used to be called in those days. The plans could not really fructify because of the mutiny, and even then conditional permission was given only if a European tanner or a currier could certify the quality of leather manufactured. Finally, in 1859, when all the tests were passed, the leather manufacturing unit came up, which in the 1880s came to be known as the Harness and Leather Factory. A very interesting thing there now, leather manufacture in Kanpur is still a major industry. In fact, in Kanpur, it is the main industry, leather manufacture. The superintendent, or what the general manager at that time used to be called, was Colonel John Stewart. Now, when OEF celebrated its 125th year, his great-grandson, Colonel John Stewart's great-grandson, found some letters of his great-grandfather which he had written, and he sent them to the factory, and one of them was published in that souvenir. Now, he was superintendent of OEF for 28 years. So, he says that, he writes that problems relating to leather manufacture all over the country are referred to me. I have become Bara Mochi. So here we have, which we always claim that the ordnance factories were the pioneers of modern manufacturing methods in India. They were engines of growth, they were catalysts of economic development. Here we have the role of the ordnance, the harness and saddlery factory, as it was called in those days, catalyzing and establishing leather manufacture in Kanpur, which to this day is a foreign exchange earner. The other area was, which I mentioned and I would like to touch upon, is clothing. While a lot of attention originally was paid to cannon and ammunition, and clothing somehow tended to be relegated to the back, and you had initially some allowances used to be given to soldiers who used to get it stitched by contractors, and there were problems of cost and quality which we are all aware of even to this day. So a committee was set up under Sir Ashley Eden, who was the Governor of Bengal, which became the stepping stone or the foundation for the setup of ordnance factories in India. He recommended the amalgamation of the clothing depot or factory of the Bombay and the Madras presidencies. And so it came up in Madras. The Calcutta manufacturing unit was in Alipur. And finally, in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, as a measure of economy, because expansion in Calcutta was not really very economical, the Alipur unit was partially shifted to Shahjahanpur. And after the war in 1925, it was shifted, the entire unit was shifted. And Shahjahanpur, as the mother clothing factory, as we call it today, was established. The Madras unit had a separate trajectory which concentrated more on a contract system. It was finally closed in 1930, and the Shahjahanpur factory was the main clothing factory. Another interesting highlight, of course, is the manufacture of steel. We were all told that steel was first manufactured in the Ordnance Factories, and it was with a Stevens Martin's open hearth furnace in Kausipur. The first steel by a modern process was in Kausipur, and then again, due to constraints of space and due to the economic constraints of expansion and buying new land in Kausipur, the steel furnace and the rolling mill was shifted to Ishapur. So this, in short, is the history of the Ordnance Factories. Of course, the Ordnance Factories served the state in times of war. We received glowing tributes for our contributions to the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, and in independent India in 23 years, 4 wars were forced upon us, in all of which the role of the Ordnance Factories has been lauded. And even during Kargil, no less a person than the Chief of Army Staff was lauded the role of the Ordnance Factories. I try to recount the growth and the beginnings of Ordnance Factories because we often tend to miss them out. And I hope you found it interesting, and I would like you to spend a moment, reflect on it, on our glorious beginnings and our present state and a future that awaits us. Thank you very much.